Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. Today's bag is a poetry bag. You don't get many poetry tote bags. This is one from the National Poetry Competition, and it is in honour of our guest today, the poet Pele Cox. W.H. Auden said poetry makes nothing happen. If Pele got that memo, she certainly ignored it. Pele has been using poetry to make things happen for all her career, and which she's going to talk about with us today. And she's done many amazing things with poetry and made many amazing things happen. She's a poetry tutor. She's been into businesses to explain to bosses, demonstrate how poetry can really bring value to their employees. She's hosted a wonderful poetry get-together called The Poets Upstairs, a loose kind of collection of poets around the Islington area and beyond. And that ended up as an event at Keats House in Hampstead. And she's just been an advocate for poetry in all kinds of ways. She has also written her own collection, that is the Mistress Account, which it's been performed a couple of times as a kind of one-woman show. That came out in 2014. And since then, she has been, she's going to tell us all about her amazing projects now. But welcome, Pele. Welcome to the book bag.
Suzi, it's a privilege to be on your book bag, in your book bag.
Yes, it's cozy in here. Join me. You've done so many interesting things, but I wanted to pick up on your various stints as poet in residence. Now, I'm sure you'll remember a time when practically every zoo and football club and fish and chip shop had a poet in residence, or so it seemed. And you were poet in residence first at the Tate in London, I believe, correct?
Yep.
Tate Modern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then you've also been poet in residence at the Royal Academy and the British School at Rome. But it seemed to me that you had a slightly different take from poets who kind of, write half a dozen poems about animals and then they go in the next collection. You wanted to do something different. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I've never been a great advocate of my own poetry. I mean, that's partly because my poetry never quite fitted. So it was always slightly on the borders. Andrew Motion was my tutor at UEA. And I was writing very codified work, which was very visual. My father's a sculptor, so I always felt I was carving from a block of stone. And I may have taken that too far, in my younger years. But the fact that I've been involved in the arts from the day I was born, I was involved in the arts. And our dinner tables filled with young up-and-coming artists in the 70s and 80s. I'd always leaned that way. So when I realised on leaving my MA at UEA that no poetry magazine would take me, even though the wonderful Andrew Motion had accepted me onto the course, I decided that my tributary out of there was going to be slightly different and that I could make the most of that. So I wrote to Nixarota and asked him if he wanted a poet in residence. Having been a poetic soul in amongst many art souls my whole life, it didn't feel unusual or strange to say, why don't you have a poet in your galleries? I think poets could bring a lot to the table. So Nixarota wrote back to me and said, that's a great idea. Come along, be poet in residence. I mean, when was that? That was in 1997, back when you could write sort of bold letters and actually reach people. I mean, I think it's still true, probably a little bit more difficult now. I do feel that I was evolving in an age that was slightly more accepting of unusual requests than it is now. But, and so that I decided that I wanted to relate to the artists on show at the Tate, Louise Bourgeois being the one that was on show when I walked in through those doors of the Turbine Hall, and her huge spider. That's when you know you've done the right thing for poetry, you know. And within 6 months, I was interviewing leaders in the curators, artists, directors about their relationship to literature and poetry. And then the finale was that I was sent to New York to interview Louise Bourgeois about her relationship to poetry. And, you know, what was beautiful about that was that it wasn't formal. It wasn't like a duologue between me and her. It wasn't that sort of that template. I was told that I could come along to her salon, which she held every month in her sort of house in New York, that anyone could come along to. You know, that set the bar for me in terms of, you know, not being aloof or elusive. I mean, you couldn't get an artist more aloof and elusive than Louise Bourgeois, but she did understand enough that, you know, she may be those things, but she also wanted to let young poets and artists into her house and help instruct them and, you know, coach them and inspire them. So I read a poem of my own out to her in the salon, and she started doing a drawing as I recited. And it was a very powerful moment. You know, we all have, as creative people, powerful moments, seminal moments. They come at you when you least expect it, and they're tattooed on you forever. And the spiral that she drew in pencil on her notebook while I said something out loud is one of those moments. Of course, I didn't ask her if I could take it with me. Sculptor's daughter.
But you say these moments creep up on you, but I think you actually plan for these moments in your own work and you make them happen. You do a lot of site-specific work. You recruit people who are going to help in the process. You've worked with actors. You write scripts. You direct. You do all kinds of things. I think you... one of the things you do time after time after time is make these moments happen. Do you think Louise Bourgeois possibly played a little part in that? You just thought, I want more of this feeling.
What she did play a part, and the part she played, and she does for all of us who love her work, I think, is that she's so she flouts everything. You know, she doesn't care about the establishment or about what people think, male, female, director, pauper. She just believes in her process and her commitment to what she believes art to be. And she draws on a lot of things, personal things. She's a very poetic artist, obviously. But I asked her some questions in the interview as well, which she didn't. She said, my assistant will answer them, or my assistant will get back to you about them. And they're the most acerbic, beautiful answers about poetry. She made me feel about 2 feet high. You know, that to me, that was, you know, a privilege that she made me feel high, you know, any kind of height at all. But they're on my website. They're really interesting.
I've had a similar experience with Margaret Atwood, interviewing Margaret Atwood on the phone. Absolutely terrifying experience. And if we can move on to the RA, the Royal Academy in London, I came to one of your events. I think it marked the end of your stint as the poet in residence, and you got various artists, Royal Academicians, to talk about their own response to poetry. Was it something to do with Cy Twombly? Was there an exhibition on at the time? I just remember people, you know, artists talking about poetry. They've got a very distinct take, haven't they?
Yes. Do you want me to talk about how that began? I'll quickly mention that when I walked in through the doors, I didn't want to write my own poems about the pictures on the walls, partly because of my experience at the Tate, and also because, you know, when you walk into a room full of Van Gogh's paintings and self-portraits and you find out that he had a great, profound love of poetry, your poetry sort of takes a back seat. So I wanted to explore what the hell those poems were, and, you know, what was the language running through his veins when he painted the sunflowers that morning in his little house in Arles in so much torment. And instead of just doing a lecture about it, I wanted to make it, expose it, you know, and expose the poetic nature of the poetry that he loved to the audiences that run through the RA. So I did a performance born of a script that I had crafted from the poems that he loved. And I had 3 actors on the dais, each one in each voice, reciting these poems. And Christian Rowe, the great actor Christian Rowe, who played Van Gogh, the audience gasped, you know, when in the last lines of the Christina Rossetti poem that Van Gogh loved about his own death. And then you realise you've cracked it, you know, in terms of literature, poetry, performance, and fine art. That's how you deliver it for people, for me anyway.
Christian is part of a little almost repertory company that you've gathered around yourself to work with. What is it about him as an actor that appeals? I mean, he's quite a chameleon, as many actors are.
Yeah, I remember he was the person who taught me what an actor is made of. And he was recommended to me by a friend at the National Theatre, because I said, like, I need someone to play Van Gogh because I've got this idea. And we met at the Curzon Cafe one evening. I'd never met him before. And he texts me and says, I'm walking in through the door now. And this guy walks in through the door and I'm like, there's no way that guy can play Van Gogh. He was tall, blonde, handsome, you know, commanding. And then we went outside to have a cigarette, because you can't smoke indoors anymore, obviously. And he was rolling this bit of tobacco. And I said, you know, come on. And now we're out in the traffic. Just read me a couple of lines from that letter. That I handed him a sheet of A4. And he started reading this Van Gogh letter. And it was like Van Gogh had walked up to me and started smoking a cigarette in front of me. He just became this artist. And it was such a thrill to be able to deliver that intimate moment on a street in Soho to an audience in the Reynolds Room at the Royal Academy. Just give it to them, give them that miracle of his performance, yeah. His understanding of the artist. You know, actors are empathizers, you know, they're readers of souls. And it's not just artists who are. Actors do it too, in a different way. And that chemistry, the actor and the artist living in that space, together through language, through poetry, is extraordinary.
So, as I've said, you've used Christian in a number of different guises, and he also went with you to Rome for a very special three nights of performance that I very shamelessly attached myself to the production. I said something like, you know, don't you need a literary consultant?
Actually,
as if you couldn't do that yourself.
I rang you up and begged you to come and review it, because I'd heard that you were a true expert on the Romantics and that you were the only woman for the job. And here we are, testament to that phone call. We're sitting here now talking about them. So
yeah. Well, I was also writing an article. I managed to pitch an article about the whole thing. But really, I was just thinking, you know, I think that, you know, there's a Keats, there's a Shelley, there's a Byron. We're all going to be in Keats Shelley House in Rome, the lovely little museum there. You know, what's not to adore about that project? But to go back to the actors, they want very specific things. And it was really interesting working with them. So I can do the whole, you know, Keats was born here, Shelley was born there. I can do all of that. But Christian asked me one of the most penetrating things really about Shelley, whom he was playing. He just said, you know, go through his illnesses with me, his bodily states.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of giving him the wordy stuff, but he has to embody it. And I just thought that was brilliant. And it was so Christian, wasn't it?
I mean, at the moment, all of the scripts that I construct are only built and made of the language, letters and poems of the time. So I actually contribute nothing in that sense. And in that sense, you build a reality for the actors. They can directly connect to the language, to the poetry, to the time, to the epoch, to the, you know, romantic mentality. It is wonderful to step out of the frame in that way. And I think Christian and Nick and Tristan and Damian and all of them have this, it's like sitting around the fireside, isn't it? Warming their hands on the flames of the greats.
And then what I think is so funny about actors is that they're off. They're like lovely little butterflies. They're very hard to catch again, aren't they? They're always off filming, doing something else.
Yeah, well, yeah, when you have very small budgets like me, not because I don't claim public funding or anything like that, then, you know, I can provide a certain amount of succor, but not enough to pay the mortgage, fortunately. Yeah.
Well,
but that's part of
you know,
the thrill.
again, you can offer them, you can offer them great experiences as well.
Yeah, and I think it's part of the thrill that we do. It's like a ski slope. It's like a black slope. You know, you've got no funds, you've got some great poetry, you've got a few good ideas, an enormous amount of talent. And what's going to happen? And it's extraordinary to not have that buffering. It's painful as well.
Yeah, it's very seat of your pants stuff, isn't it? But I also think it's so appropriate for the Romantic poets, especially. Well, Keats was as poor as anything, you know. I mean, he wasn't absolutely destitute, but he didn't have a lot of money. Shelley was kind of living on endless loans because he'd actually been cut off by his family. Byron's estate he was nominally rich, but he wasn't really rich, was he? They were all living on loans. And escaping to Italy because it was cheap to live there. So I think in a way it's appropriate to do what you do, to do this sort of very, you know, bare bones approach to their lives. Yeah, there's a lovely quote from Shelley that I've always enjoyed, where he said, "I always go on until I am stopped, but I never am stopped." So
lovely. That's so him, isn't it?
It's
he was
so
stopped.
him. Until fate stopped him.
Stop him.
Yeah.
You know, he only let the elements stop him.
Yeah, very true. So you then moved on into making films, which was partly you did this before COVID, didn't you? I mean, COVID made it essential, but I think you made a film about Rodin.
Yeah, so I was meant to do a performance at Stanford, where I was living with my husband Fabio, about the Rodin collection, and then COVID struck, so we thought we'll just make it a film of it. Of course, then there was a lot of political stuff happening at Stanford in the Cantor Museum, the change of leadership, so it fell by the wayside. But I was going to do a live performance of Keats's death, my script, Lift Me Up, I Am Dying, for John and Virginia Murray, who are a testament to the way patronage could and should work, private patronage in this country. They've given me so much support, love, and funds, kept me going. It's not the money keeps me going, but their belief in me is the most precious thing of all. And I was going to do this performance for them at Albemarle Street, where Byron and Walter Scott used to hang out, and where John Murray II created a world in which writers could become friends and family and have a sociable existence under the canopy of this publisher's great understanding and compassion. Anyway, we couldn't do it because of COVID, and I said, to John and Jenny, why don't I make a film instead? And they went, no, don't do that. Just wait till it's all blown over and we'll do it at Albemarle Street. So I said, okay. And then I decided that we should make a film instead anyway, because it just felt like all the giants had gone to sleep during COVID. You know, all the museums and theatres were closed. And so I could feel this space emerging where something could be said quite loudly. So I asked the actors, Nick Rowe, who played Seven in Lift Me Up, I'm Dying at Keats Shelley House, and to play Seven. I asked Christian to play Keats, and asked Nick if Damian Lewis would play Shelley, because he'd done a little performance for me at Albemarle Street with Helen McCrory, the amazing Helen McCrory, about 4 years before. And Damian said yes. So they all filmed themselves in their houses. That's Tufnell Park, Putney, Antwerp, London, and we were in Ludlow. You, Suzi, wrote the most extraordinary sonnet about Keats, which was one of the voiceovers in the piece, which brought it immediately into the contemporary imagination. And we gathered together all the WhatsApp parts and edited it in our little house in Ludlow with an amazing guy who's a manager of the Starbucks here, who went to art school and has the most brilliant eye. So we were a little company of souls, you know, sailing through that lockdown, and we created something wonderful, I think.
And I think it's still on the website of the British School at Rome. They were involved in some way, weren't they?
Yes, well, I just asked if we could borrow their YouTube, and they said yes.
Right. And it had a little premiere, and I remember, as you say, there was nothing going on at all. You know, there were no cinemas, theatre. It was a really extraordinary time, and sitting down with a glass of wine to a proper premiere on your laptop was just fantastic.
And it was, the laptop became a candle flame, didn't it? It's like we all
exactly.
This flame, 4,000 people, the exact hour that John Keats had died 200 years before. There was a sense of what's the word I'm looking for? Visitation.
Yes. Yes. Well, you know, a very strong thing I felt about the event that was in Rome. It's the Keats Shelley Museum is in the building on Spanish Steps that Keats lived in and died in, and there's just something about being in there by candlelight. You know, with these actors dressed up, with yourself dressed up as Mary Shelley. You know, when you performed as well. And I remember coming down the Spanish Steps in twilight just before it was all going to begin for the first performance. And there were Byron and Shelley on the terrace, dressed in their gear, having a fag. But, you know, apart from the cigarettes, I could have gone back in time 200 years. It was the eeriest thing, you know, with the modern day tourists going up and down the Scalinata. And kind of almost not seeing this little scene. And then inside I could see it was all candlelit and I could just see you. And it was really amazing. I just thought, I'm going back in time. I'm really meeting these people.
And often the cigarette and the jeans helps you to feel the past, because it's not this delineated, you know, cut out character, is it? It's someone that melts between the now and the then quite easily.
Well, they were very contemporary figures in their time. They were the most exciting people around. You know, they would have had motorbikes if they could have. I always think Shelley's boat is like a Porsche. It's like a James Dean Porsche, you know, where he was kind of going faster. I've got to get this thing to go faster. You know, but there is this sort of death wish as well. But the whole experience there was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I'd like the film that you made. I think you're doing a kind of loose trilogy. Is that correct? Because it's all 200 years, isn't it, since, you know, the time of the Young Romantics?
Yes,
bicentenaries.
Yes, I mean, you know, one would love to stick to exact dates, but they won't mind that, you know, I'm a couple of months off the actual death date in the second one, which is about Shelley, which is called Dreamboat, which is about his visit to Byron's. It's meta. It's about his visit to Byron's palace in Venice, and that 2 days over which they talk deeply about their poetry and their philosophy. And then the film quickly breaks and becomes about Shelley's death. And of course, the reason I wanted to set it in Venice is because Shelley drowns. Also, Venice is sinking. The world is sort of sinking and burning. And the two actors are older. So it's as if Shelley and Byron had grown old. And the film is sort of about extinction and the end of things. And it's 35 minutes long. We're making it at the moment. We went to Venice for 3 days and shot loads of footage. And I watched some of it, a few of the rushes the other day. And the actors, Nick Rose and Robert Portal's command of language and poetry brings Byron and Shelley into an immediate frame that, you know, it's nothing short of Netflix, basically. So
when will it be complete, and when can we see it? When and where?
Yes, when will it be complete and when can we see it? You know, I wake up every day asking myself that question. Which means it's a living thing. Well, hopefully October, I think it will be done. And we're filming it in Venice in a palace. Suzi, you'll be next to me on the front seat, I hope.
Oh, you bet.
And also it will be screened at John Murray, who have sponsored the film this time. We dedicated the Keats film to them because they've been such extraordinary figures of culture in the cultural landscape. They support a lot of small museums and keep them alive. So we want to screen the first screening in Albemarle Street, where Byron used to drink with Walter Scott and John Murray II, and where Byron's memoirs were burned, of course. So that will be in October too. Yeah.
Yes, the scandalous or not scandalous enough. I mean, that's the maddening thing. We don't know whether they were absolutely outrageous or whether people thought this is more boring than we want Byron to come across. I mean, he can't ever have been boring. I mean, he wrote the most brilliant letters that were so witty and so funny. I don't think he was capable of being boring, actually.
But they just humanize him, don't they? You know, he was not just some cad who walked in and women fell at his feet. He was far more interesting and seminal than that, and humane than that, and you know, an activist just like Shelley, just like Keats, the proper political beings.
Yeah.
Their time.
Yeah. They totally were. So you did a wonderful film in lockdown. We're now all out of lockdown. I just wanted to go back to lockdown just for a moment, because another thing that you did that was really transformational, I think, was the weekly poetry class in lockdown. And again, you have a different twist on all of this, that it wasn't primarily about writing. You've never been one for writing exercises, you know, go and pick a color and write, you know, you don't do that. You sort of inspire in a much more kind of oblique way, but it was more about reading poetry through lockdown and using it as a resource, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Suzi, you're the other person I know who feels this as deeply as me, apart from our dear soulmates who come to the group. I always believed, and I think, again, this is because of my upbringing, that, you know, the past, what went before you, what was written before you were even written, and will always be better than you can ever write it yourself, is where you begin. And you have to begin with what's happened in art before you. And this is even more true for me with poetry, because the poets spell out the pathway, don't they? And you can pick which pathway you want. And each week, you know, I pick a basic theme. So, for example, well, or a poet even. So Christina Rossetti, for example, is not a poet we think about particularly often. Of course, we read her poems, but we don't dig into her and find out how she ticked or what her circumstances were. So, for example, we would all go off and read something by Christina Rossetti, pick what we liked, read about her life, and then read on Zoom the poem we'd brought out loud. And sometimes we'd read a longer poem in the round out loud on Zoom. And I think you'll agree, Suze, it was so effective, wasn't it? You know, Zoom was not was not restrictive in terms of being able to feel the language and the togetherness of how the poem was constructed and how the poem's construction brought us together. And then, of course, if anyone wants to write a poem that inspires them on that subject or theme or stanza, then they write it and over the week and bring it along and read that out too. And I think that's all you really need to do with a poet. You know, I don't think if a poet is properly on the pulse of their own voice, and of course we're all quite advanced, but even a beginner can catch up pretty fast if they're reading great poetry and hearing great poetry. They can click into their own voice and their own mechanism effectively. And I think there's too much over managing of poetic voices at the moment, and that you just need to steer your student to the greats and all will be well.
I remember being amazed that there was such a thing as a poetry editor. But of course, you know, we have great poetry editors like Don Patterson, Robin Robertson around. But I suppose I had this romantic idea that it just flows and, you know, don't touch the genius.
That's the right way round, though, isn't it? Rather than trying to pre-edit someone and tell them what a good thing to write about might be, or a good way to write about it might be, let them write it and then teach them to edit it. You're right, 60% of the process, I think, is the editing bit.
And when it comes to your own writing, you're tremendously giving. So these sessions would be 2 hours and it would be an absolutely packed 2 hours. But you would only very rarely come up with something that you'd written, you know, and you weren't being paid for this. You were giving your time like everybody else. So I do think, in a way, you know, I think all of us were thinking we'd like to hear more Pele. It was a real treat when you came up with something, but it was actually quite rare.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I think I said once it would be a bit like the conductor coming round into the orchestra and picking up the violin. Secondly, that's the first reason. That's the most important answer. But also, you know, I'm constantly, everything I've done the past 10 years has been a fascinating adventure, collaboration with great talent, but also it's been a way of avoiding having to write my own stuff. And I have written something that I think about at night, the Mistress Account, and I think, well, how am I gonna square this with myself? I've called myself a poet for 10 years, and I haven't written much. And then I think, but I wrote the Mistress Account, and that is, for me, the greatest thing I ever did, because I'm really proud of it. And I'm going to write another collection again when someone gives me an empty house on a moor somewhere for 3 months, so I can actually get down to my own work again one day soon.
Okay, anybody out there? Anybody with a spare house? That would be brilliant. I'm sure you will manage it. You know, you don't need to do a geographical, do you?
No, I think it's symbolic, and I know lots of us understand this, particularly women, is that it's about turning it round onto oneself, you know, the desire for the art in one's life. You have to work really hard to carve out a small slot for your own, and that's really inspiring, you know, that it is within reach. and it's worth it when you get there. And we're all capable of it.
What I loved about the sessions during lockdown, they I think it was sort of 6 to 8 p.m, wasn't it? And we would have our glasses of wine at the ready. It actually felt like socializing. It really did.
A party.
It was like a party. And then we often had a friend of yours from San Francisco, the wonderful artist Kate Nelson. And she would, because she's in a different time zone, she would have been up all night. So it was breakfast, but she'd have a glass of red wine. It was like work all night.
Yeah, the Californian light coming through her section of the screen, of the Zoom screen. Wasn't it? It was like she gave a little bit of California to our proceedings, and we gave a little bit of the British dark, the European.
Yeah, and also I think there was kind of quite a lot of civil unrest in San Francisco at the time, so she was sort of bringing this quite sense of danger and excitement. But again, it's part of your mission to break poetry open and say it's not just for poetry heads, it's really for everybody.
Yeah, break it like bread.
And share it.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, I'm going to wind up by asking you 3 questions that I'm asking people who drop into the book bag. And this is especially appropriate for you. The first one, I would like to know, what is your favourite artwork?
Yeah, well, I'd like to split this one quickly.
You're allowed.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to say that my favourite artwork is by Velázquez, and it's Las Meninas. And the reason I love that so deeply, more and more as I get older, is because it is actually a performance space for the viewer. And Fabio told me about it when we were at the Prado the other day. I've always loved it. And then when he explained it, I knew why. And you are part of the action as you stand there. And you can only understand it when you stand there, and every time you stand there you understand it differently. So that to me is just one of the magnificent modern statements of our being. And also my father, his sculpture Interior Space, which is an extraordinary triumph of modernity over timelessness and futurism. Again, he's pulled a huge block of porphyry out of the Egyptian desert. He's the only sculptor to have been given permission to do so since the Romans, and has created this box which has a slit down the middle, an aperture, dark aperture down the middle, and you can climb into it and walk around as if you are the dead and the living all at once. So that one.
Whereabouts is that? Is it in a collection somewhere?
I'm looking at it right now. It's in his big studio over the way, looming like a tiger.
Mm. He does amazing things with stone, sort of cutting the stone and polishing it and fixing it so that it almost makes a picture in itself. It's sort of, you can enter the stone. Extraordinary.
It's performative, just like Velázquez, actually. Yeah. You are part of the work.
My next question, you're very well read in poetry, obviously. Is there any kind of author or book or poet where you should have got to grips with them and you never have for some reason, or you just don't get them? I'm calling it the book of shame.
Well, I do get it, and I get it even without having read it, which means I'm being arrogant, but sometimes you feel you have absorbed something without actually ever having picked it up. And I will, I promise. And it's Ulysses by James Joyce.
Yes. Yeah, that was my life as a literary editor. I was just absorbing everybody else's views the whole time. There were lots of things that I felt, I'll just borrow Blake Morrison's view on that. I don't need to have my own. Yeah, well, that'll be an interesting one when you settle down.
I suppose it's built so many poems, that book. It's the foundation for so many poems that reading it will be a weird kind of time travel. Yeah.
I mean, you'll be more familiar with the Greek epics, I'm sure. The story of Ulysses is something that you would know well. So you'll come at it from that angle, maybe.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any really weird, unhelpful, bizarre feedback about your work, either in film or poetry or whatever?
Yeah, I think the weirdest one was someone said, I don't like the way you write your scripts, or I don't like your scripts or the way they're written, which I thought was extraordinary considering that they were built and made of some of the greatest poetry and letters ever written. So there you go.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I'm sure there was a good reason, but they're not something that you like or don't like necessarily. They're an evocation of something that's
it's like the pyramids or something. There's no point saying I don't like the shape.
That's like saying I don't like your photo of the pyramids. Okay, maybe I didn't take the photo very well, but it's still the pyramids. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. When your film is completed, when your trilogy, I mean, you're going to do another film about Byron, I believe. So
next year, yeah.
You'll have to come back and talk about those. But in the meantime, Pele Cox, it's been wonderful having you here. And join us another time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for asking me on.
Thank you very much for tuning in to the book bag. If you like what we've been chatting about, make sure you subscribe. There'll be more wonderful interviews coming along soon. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.